All right, let's talk about pressure. What really happens when things and, people get pushed to their absolute limits? How do they perform? And maybe more importantly, what actually makes them break? We're going to dig into the surprising connection between the two.
Yeah, I know. It sounds like the beginning of a really weird joke, right? But the answer, it tells us something absolutely fundamental about how both super advanced machines and our own minds handle intense stress. And to figure that out, we're going to look at two totally different kinds of stress tests.
So, first up, we are heading into the world of material science. This is where stress is a physical force, something you can literally measure and predict. It's clean, it gives us some hard numbers, and it's a fantastic model for starting to understand our own breaking points.
So picture this. In a study from the National Institutes of Health, researchers took this super high-performance polymer composite. We're talking the kind of advanced stuff you'd find in a jet wing or a fancy medical device, and they basically just tried to break it. They put it through what they call cyclic loads, which is really just a fancy way of saying they pushed and pulled on it over and over and over again, just to find its absolute limit.
Now, the key thing they were measuring is something called fatigue life. The best way to think about it is like this. How many times can you bend a paperclip back and forth before it just snaps? That number, that's its fatigue life. And for this superplastic, scientists wanted to find out its magic number. So, how'd they make it stronger? How'd they improve that number? Well, the secret sauce was all in the material's recipe. It was a composite, and it was filled with these tiny little carbon fibers. So the researchers tested different batches, one with 10% fiber, one with 20%, and one with 30%. And the results, as you can see, were just crystal clear. The more filler you add, the longer its fatigue life. Simple as that. And that's the crucial takeaway from this part. The material's resilience wasn't just some random property. Nope, it was engineered. By changing the internal makeup, by adding more of that carbon fiber filler, they could predictably make the material tougher and way more resistant to failure. Now hold on to that idea of a filler. It's going to be important. Okay, so now let's pivot and look at the human side of this whole equation. What happens when the stress isn't a physical force, but a psychological one? What's the breaking point for the human mind? And can we engineer resilience there too? And this is where you see the parallel. For the machines, it's all about physical force. For us, it's psychological pressure. For those materials, it's a measurable strain. For our minds, we call it cognitive load. The sheer amount of information we're trying to juggle at once. The principles here are actually remarkably similar.
So, where do we get our clues? Well, a huge literature review from NASA, and let's be real, if anyone is obsessed with human performance under pressure, it's NASA, gives us our first major insight. As this quote explains, when we're under stress, our attention narrows. We get tunnel vision. We focus only on the main thing right in front of us and start ignoring everything else on the sides.
And this idea, it actually has a name, the tunnel hypothesis. Our field of perception literally shrinks down. You can think of it like a tiny crack starting to form in our awareness. Now, sometimes this can be a good thing. It helps a pilot focus on one critical warning light. But it can also be catastrophic if that information you're ignoring is actually, life or death important. And the consequences of this are very real. We scan our environment less. We consider fewer options when we make a decision. There was even one study where people who were under the mild threat of an electric shock literally looked at fewer answers on a multiple choice test. And, as you can guess, their scores went down. Our world shrinks, and so do our choices. But wait, it's not just our attention that takes a hit. The NASA review shows again and again that stress directly messes with our working memory. This is your brain's RAM. It's that temporary scratch pad you use for problem solving. When you're stressed, that space gets all cluttered up with worries and distracting thoughts, leaving way less room for you to actually focus on the task at hand. Okay, so we've seen how things break. The plastic fails from getting bent over and over. Our brains fail when our attention tunnels and our working memory gets totally overloaded. So the real question, the billion-dollar question is, how do we stop it from happening? And this, right here, is where our two stories come together beautifully. For the machine, the solution was a physical filler. More carbon fiber. For the human mind, the solution is a cognitive filler. Things like experience, overtraining, and targeted psychological skills that become so automatic, you don't even have to think about them under pressure. One of the most effective ways to build that mental filler is a technique called stress inoculation training. It's a really systematic approach. First, you just learn about your own personal stress response. What happens to you? Second, you learn some practical coping skills. And third, and this is the most important part, you practice using those skills in realistic simulations, slowly building up your tolerance, just like adding more and more filler to that composite.
So, why does any of this matter? Well, because performance under pressure isn't about magic, and it's definitely not about luck. Whether we're talking about a piece of plastic or a human being, it's about systematically engineering resilience. It's about understanding the limits and then building in the strength to withstand the force.
So, remember that plastic composite? Just how strong could they actually make it? Well, the final prediction from all their data is, honestly, it's staggering. That's over 44 million cycles before it's expected to fail. I mean, think about that. We put an incredible amount of thought and effort into making sure the technology we rely on, our planes, our tools, our buildings, can handle immense pressure. We build them to be resilient by design.
And that brings it all back home, doesn't it? It leaves us with the final and most crucial question. If we can so carefully and methodically engineer strength into our materials, what does it look like to apply that same deliberate, systematic approach to engineering resilience in our own minds? What's your carbon fiber?